So think for a moment about needing something. Well, seemingly simple, right? Like maybe a sturdy tire for some new factory equipment.
Or maybe enough soap to keep a big, bustling city healthy.
Yeah, or even just, the makings of a good steak dinner.
Right. And between, say, 1750 and 1900, needs like these, but like massively amplified on a global scale, they set off this huge chain reaction.
Totally reshaping economies all over the planet.
Yeah.
We've gathered some really fascinating sources that get into this whole global economic development picture.
Hmm. And they focus quite a bit on the role of, well, environmental demands the need for stuff from the earth.
Yeah, and look, when you first look at global economics from this time, it can feel, I don't know, a bit overwhelming.
Oh, absolutely. It's like trying to grasp this giant, super complex machine with like a million moving parts all connecting.
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're aiming for in this deep dive. We're going to try and pull out the really crucial bits, the most interesting insights from all this material.
Connect some dots, maybe.
Yeah, hopefully reveal some of those aha moments,
All right.
show how the world we know today really started taking shape back then.
Right.
We're less interested in just dry theory,
Right.
and we want to dig into the why and the how. How did this demand for environmental resources actually drive this massive global shift?
And I think our mission here is pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about understanding how that relentless need, mostly from industrializing nations for raw materials and food,
Yeah, food too.
how that fundamentally changed economies everywhere else, turned a lot of regions into basically export factories.
Okay, so let's unpack that fundamental shift you mentioned.
Mm.
Because in many parts of the world, places in Africa, Asia, the Americas, the way things generally worked economically was subsistence farming.
People mostly grew or made what they needed themselves locally to survive.
Right. And what happens during this period, 1750 to 1900, is this big move away from that
Yeah, huge move.
towards economies that are all about producing raw materials or agricultural stuff to sell far away in distant markets.
And it's important to stress this wasn't always like a smooth or voluntary thing, was it?
No, not at all. Far from it. This shift was really pushed, driven by what we call imperial powers.
Okay, so when we say imperial powers here, we're talking mainly Britain, France, Belgium, those kinds of nations.
Exactly. Nations exerting huge political and economic control over other territories. And they were doing it mostly because they needed the resources, right, to fuel their own industrial growth back home.
Acting totally in their own self-interest, aggressively going after natural resources, industrial crops, whatever their factories needed.
Precisely. So, okay, let's dig into that first big driver, that just massive hunger, that insatiable need of the industrial factories for raw materials. What jumped out at you from the sources on this?
Well, cotton is like the classic example, isn't it?
For sure. Britain's textile mills, they were like these giant, constantly hungry beasts.
And initially, a lot of their cotton came from the U.S.
Right. But then you get the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. And suddenly that main supply just dries up or slows way down.
And this is where it gets really interesting, like you said. Britain then leans heavily on places like Egypt.
Yeah, basically turning Egypt into one gigantic cotton farm for British mills.
The sources suggest that by the end of the 19th century, Egypt's economy was almost entirely about exporting cotton to Britain.
Wow. Talk about putting all your eggs in one basket, that level of concentration.
It's incredible.
If,
And while maybe it brought in money initially, for Britain at least, it left Egypt incredibly vulnerable, didn't it, to swings in cotton prices.
Totally. And it stopped other industries from developing. It's a pattern you see again and again.
It really shows how, one big event like a war in one place could just ripple outwards and totally transform somewhere else economically.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And that single crop focus, like you said, creates this massive vulnerability.
Yeah. Then you got the whole river boom, Amazon, Congo Basin.
Right. Think about it. Cars were starting to become a thing. All sorts of machinery needed, rubber parts, tires.
Demand just shot up.
But here, the contrast in who benefited is just stark.
Yeah, that's a crucial point for the European powers' huge economic gains, right? But then you look at the Congo Free State under King Leopold II of Belgium.
Oh, it's beyond grim.
The extraction of rubber there, it came at this absolutely horrific human cost. It makes you ask, whose development are we actually talking about here?
It's just a truly dark, dark chapter. You had forced labor, unbelievable violence, millions of Congolese people killed or mutilated just to get rubber out of the jungle.
And it wasn't isolated. In the Amazon, too, indigenous people were enslaved, abused by these rubber barons.
And a really sobering reminder, isn't it?
Yeah.
That often this Economic progress for some was built on the intense suffering of others.
Definitely. The sources also mention palm oil from West Africa. Maybe not the first thing people think of.
No, maybe not, but it was super important. They needed it for making soap, which, with growing cities, hygiene became a bigger deal, and crucially, as a lubricant for all that new factory machinery.
Ah, right. For the machines themselves.
Exactly. So just like cotton and rubber, you see these big palm oil plantations getting set up, often using forced or enslaved labor.
And again, the local economy has become dominated by exporting this one thing.
Yep. It's the same pattern over and over.
Yeah.
A resource becomes valuable to the industrial powers, and then the existing ways of life, the economies in those resource-rich places, get completely rewired, often violently, to just pump out that resource for the benefit of the empire.
Right. And then there's the slightly more surprising one, guano, from Peru and Chile.
Bird poop. Slight check.
Slight chuckle, yeah, literally bird droppings, but incredibly potent stuff.
That's fertilizer, right?
Exactly. These huge piles of it built up over centuries on coastal islands became this super valuable resource for boosting crop yields, especially for those industrial crops being grown elsewhere.
That's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
Shows how even weird environmental factors could suddenly become globally important economically.
It really does. And speaking of agriculture,
Yeah.
steak dinners.
Ah, yes, the beef. Argentina, Uruguay. They became huge beef exporters, didn't they? Especially to Britain.
Yeah, European populations were growing fast, more people could afford meat, demand went up.
And this is where technology really changes things. Those refrigerated ships, the reefer ships.
That was key, wasn't it? Suddenly you could ship perishable stuff, like meat, across the Atlantic without it spoiling. Total game changer.
Absolutely. And the British didn't just buy the beef. They invested heavily in the whole system.
Right, they weren't just customary.
No, they funded the railways to get the cattle to the coast, built up the ports, invested in the meatpacking plants. British banks and companies often had huge stakes.
So it really tied the economies of Argentina and Uruguay directly into Britain's needs.
Deeply interconnected them. Again, that pattern of external investment shaping, even directing a region's economy, and creating these dependencies.
Which were often very long-lasting. And then you can't talk about resources from this era without mentioning diamonds.
Oh, yeah. Diamonds from Africa. Diamonds are forever. Maybe the profits were forever for the colonizers.
Yeah.
It's more like it.
Yeah. European powers, Britain especially, just ruthlessly exploited diamond finds, particularly in South Africa.
Cecil Rhodes, De Beers.
Mm.
They basically created a monopoly, didn't they?
Pretty much. Controlled the mining, controlled the trade.
And it's crucial how they did it.
Absolutely. Through exploiting cheap African labor, imposing really harsh, dangerous working conditions.
Generated massive wealth for European shareholders and elites.
While at the same time creating deep racial inequalities and economic structures built purely around extraction. Legacies that, we still see the effects of today.
Definitely. It wasn't just digging up stones. It was building a whole system of control around it.
Right. So, okay, that's the huge pull for raw materials. But you mentioned another big engine driving all this.
Yeah, the other side of the coin was the need to feed all the people flocking to the cities back in the industrialized countries.
Right. Industrialization equals urbanization. Factories pull people into cities looking for work.
Huge growth in urban populations.
And those city dwellers, they can't grow their own food anymore.
Nope. So you get this massive growing demand for imported food.
And just like with the raw materials, colonial economies get twisted around to meet that demand too.
Yeah, you see this big shift towards growing cash crops, specifically for export things like sugar, coffee.
Alongside that demand for meat we talked about from places like Argentina, Brazil, feeding the growing middle classes in Europe.
So it's not just feeding the factories, it's feeding the factory workers and the wider urban population. It almost feels like these regions were being set up, so
right.
Dependent on what people thousands of miles away wanted to eat or use.
And that switch in farming away from growing food for local people towards these big export crops that had huge, often really negative impacts locally.
Yeah, which kind of leads us nicely into the effects of all this, because one massive effect was that the money, the profits from exporting all this stuff, it mostly didn't stay there, did it?
No, not really. The profits largely flowed back to the imperial powers. And often, that money was then used by the people in the colonies to buy finished manufactured goods.
From those same imperial powers.
Exactly. The sources use Britain's colonial expansion as a prime example. They needed and created these sort of closed or captive markets for their own factory output.
Think about it. You're forced to grow cotton, sell it cheap to Britain, and then you have to buy your clothes or tools back from British factories at a higher price.
It's a very lopsided relationship, kind of a one-way street, economically speaking.
Totally. And focusing so heavily on just one or two cash crops meant these colonies became super reliant on the world market, even for basic food they used to grow themselves.
You can definitely see echoes of that kind of resource dependency in many parts of the world even now. Those historical power dynamics cast long shadows.
Which gets us to that core issue, the growing economic dependency. The whole system, the way these colonial economies were reorganized, it was all designed to benefit the imperial powers.
Not the local people.
No, not their well-being, not their own balanced development. It created this lasting dependency that would shape things for, well, decades, if not longer.
Absolutely.
So just to kind of wrap up the main points from our deep dive, we've seen these two huge forces at play between 1750 and 1900. First, that massive growing need for raw materials to fuel industry.
Cotton, rubber, palm oil, minerals.
And second, the increasing demand for food to feed the booming cities in those industrial nations.
Meat, sugar, coffee, grains.
And the result was this fundamental rewiring of economies all over the globe, turning them into export-focused systems, often centered on just a few commodities.
Which crucially created this significant power imbalance and this deep-seated economic dependence on the imperial centers.
Yeah, and maybe that leaves a lingering thought or a question for you, our listener, to mull over.
How do the echoes of those 19th century economic structures, those dependencies that were built back then, how do they continue to shape global trade and development right now, today?
What lasting impacts can we still kind of trace back? It's definitely worth thinking about, isn't it?
Yeah.
The long shadow of history.
It really is.
Well, thanks for digging deep into this with us.
Thank you.